Wow, how beautiful is that? That's Eitan Katz doing Avinu Malkeinu, which we sang so often during the days of awe from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? A good Moedim L'Simcha. We wish each other a beautiful days of rejoicing during these intermediate days of the festival of Sukkot. As we learned when we were studying Sukkah, the first 2 days outside of Israel are, complete festival days, all the laws of festivals, like we're studying here in Tractate Beitzah. And the final 2 days, which are really Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot is its own festival. And outside of Israel, that's a 2-day festival. But that second day has come to be called Simchas Torah, when we celebrate completing the cycle of reading the Torah over the course of the year and starting over. But today, of course, the big news, like it is every Friday, is a Guten Erev Shabbos to you. It's Erev Shabbos. It's the afternoon before Shabbos begins tonight. Let's light up the darkness. We appear to be streaming properly. I've got several solutions that we're working on to make sure it doesn't happen again. And with God's help, it won't. Quick story that I wanted to share yesterday, a Sukkot story, right? Sukkot or Sukkot, it's the same thing. It's that Northern European Ashkenaz pronunciation where the T's become S's and the O's become O's, etc. At any rate, this lovely story about a Gabbai, the Gabbai of the Berditchever Rebbe a couple hundred years ago. I'm the Gabbai in our minyan. The Gabbai is sort of like an assistant, an administrative manager, an MC. The rabbi does the teaching in the minyan, and the Gabbai sort of makes sure that everything runs smoothly. When people have aliyahs, it's my job to distribute the aliyahs, to pick people who's going to come up and get an honor reading the Torah. When we auction aliyahs to do a fundraiser, the Gabbai does that. So, Sukkot a couple hundred years ago in Ukraine, in Berditchev, it could easily happen that it was very difficult to get an esrog, right? Nina, if you're watching, could you bring our lulav and esrog? Might as well share how it looks when it's all tied up. This is what we use every day of the festival. When we make Hoshanas, we walk in a circle around the room with the minyan. At any rate, the esrog, as we've talked about lots of times, is the citron, the lemon-like fruit. Has a beautiful scent, a beautiful flavor, and it's one of the 4 species with which we perform this Torah obligation of waving the 4 species during Sukkot. In Northern Europe, in Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, a couple hundred years ago, 300 years, 400 years ago, and stretching back, not easy to get an esrog in that kind of a climate. And sometimes they couldn't get them at all. Sometimes only the very wealthiest people who planned far in advance and, think about it. Some traveler on wagon, donkey cart, perhaps walking all the way, had to bring that fruit, from the Mediterranean. It's a tropical fruit. And to get it all the way up there on the dirt roads, those passageways, there were many years when there were no esrogim or there was one esrog in the whole town. So there was 1 year like that. There was just one esrog in the town of Berdichev, where there were tens of thousands of Jews. Here we go. Thank you.
Where's the lulav? I looked everywhere.
Well, the last time I saw it, it was in the family room in its big plastic case. I don't know. I mean, it must be there. Okay, well, this is our esrog. Okay, so this is our esrog this year. Very nice esrog. When I bought it, immediately its shape appealed to me. And it really smells nice. Okay, so there was only one such esrog that year in Berdichev. And then the other three species, right, the date palm branch, the willow branch, and the myrtle tree branch. And those much easier to obtain in the northern climates. I mean, the date palm branch, not super easy, but it travels easier than the esrog, let's say. At any rate, the Gabbai of the Berdichever Rebbe knew what was going to happen on that first day of Sukkot, on the first day of the holiday. The Rebbe would get up before dawn, and right at daybreak, he would bathe in the mikveh, which there was an icy cold river. And then he would come out, and then he would be the first to say the blessing over performing the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. And then he would wave it in the 6 directions. And then the people of the town, all the Jews of the town, tens of thousands, would be lined up, for a mile. And everybody would go quickly and take their turn. And the Rebbe would pass to the prominent scholars, and the scholars to the prominent citizens, and the prominent citizens to the less prominent citizens. And at the very end of the day, with the sun sinking below the horizon and perhaps too late to perform the mitzvah, because this is a daytime mitzvah, would come the Gabbai, who had overseen all these activities for the whole day, but goes last, right? And maybe doesn't even get to perform the mitzvah if the day is short and there are just too many people with the one esrog to fulfill the mitzvah. And so he thought to himself, while the Rebbe is in the mikvah, it's daytime, and I could perform the mitzvah, and I could go first, and I could be sure to perform the mitzvah this year. So when the Rebbe went down into the mikveh, his Gabbai went into the Rebbe's office, took the esrog, took the lulav, the other three species, picked it up, and he was just a little bit nervous, maybe a little bit with the sweaty palms, and the esrog dropped. Now, an esrog, there are two kinds. Some have this pitum, some don't. I prefer with the pitum. Thank you, honey. Okay, thank you. I'll just show you our lulav in a moment. And but this is one with the pitum. If you have an esrog with a pitum and the pitum breaks off, that renders the esrog pasul, no good, nullified, no longer fit for use. And that's what happened to that Gabbai. He dropped it, the pitum broke off, and now the one esrog in Berdichev had been rendered nil, no good. Nobody can perform the mitzvah, lulav and esrog. None of the tens of thousands of Jews, and most especially the Rebbe. The Gabbai was, mortified, humiliated, embarrassed, terrified. What would the Rebbe say? There's no way to hide it. The Rebbe comes up from the mikveh, and his Gabbai says, Rebbe, I don't know what to tell you. I'm so sorry. And with tears pouring out of his eyes, I broke it. I broke the esrog. I wanted to perform the mitzvah because sometimes I don't even get to perform it and I go last at the end of the day and it gets dark. And so before it all started, I wanted to be sure that I could at least do it, and I dropped it, and I'm so sorry. What did the Berdichever Rebbe say? He looked up and he said, Master of the universe, see how your children love you. This simple Jew. loves you so much, was so dedicated to you, wanted so badly to perform the mitzvah, not risk that he wouldn't be able to perform the mitzvah, that he risked his job. That guy was a professional gabbai. That was his whole livelihood, is to be the Rebbe's gabbai. He risked his whole job and livelihood to perform the mitzvah. Let that be a substitute for the lulav and esrog this year. We should all have hearts as big as the Berditchever Rebbe, especially toward our fellows, and try to understand and give them the benefit of the doubt and see the good in what they're trying to do. A beautiful sukkah story. Just so I show it to you, here is the other three species that we wave when we take them together. So I keep them wrapped so they remain moist. So this is just a bit of tin foil and then a moist rag, which I'll put over here. Now this is tied in the Chabad manner, just like in our family we tie our tefillin in the Chabad manner in memory of Shlomo Schwartz, Rebbe Shlomo Schwartzy Schwartz. We do our lulav in the Chabad manner also. So I tied myself this year. I actually showed a picture of it the other day. And so in most people, actually, the normal ways, they'll just have, maybe 2 or 3 of these myrtle branches on one side and like 2 or 3 of the willow branches on the other side. And that's it. Chabad, they add a lot more myrtle branches. Mine has 12. My Rav has 36. So it's a real thick packet of the myrtle. But at any rate, there it is. You see, and it's getting moist. So the willow leaf is a little bit, past its prime, but they're still moist and good. And it's all tied together. It has to be one of the species that are used for the ties. So these are bits of palm branch. Right? This palm branch, palm. I don't think you call them leaves, right? But I don't know, the parts, the elements of the date palm branch is what is also used to tie these 3 together. And see, if I was going to pick them up together, I would be sure to keep the esrog down, because when I take them together, I've then actually done the mitzvah of taking them, and I haven't said that bracha yet, and I'm not doing it right now. I would do it later. So there you go. Put that away carefully. Okay. Just put that aside right now. Okay. We have an exciting page. We are opening a new chapter here in Tractate Beitzah. These are the laws of festivals. This is the 8th volume of the Talmud. We are on page 24, opening chapter 3. Now we're talking about, the main thing we've been talking about is that just like on Shabbos, on a festival, all of those 39 prohibited labors that we can't do on Shabbos, we can't do on a festival, except that we can do the labors that are directly related to food preparation. And once we could do those labors, we could do very similar labors if they're for the sake of the festival, right? So the type of like we can carry, we can slaughter, we can kindle, we can cook. So we can do those for the sake of food preparation. And we can do those same labors even if it's not for the sake of food preparation, but it must still be for the sake of the festival, not for something that's beyond the festival and doesn't need to be done that day. Now in chapter 3, we're going to sort of go back in time a little bit when we're thinking about, okay, we want to rejoice on the festival, so we want to have meat on the festival. For the sages, rejoicing required meat. So we're going to cook the meat. To have meat to cook, we're going to slaughter an animal and butcher it and carry it. All of that is going to be permitted. What if the animal requires trapping? Right? You can't hunt, right? A Jew who observes the laws of kashrus, right, who's kosher eating, is never actually going to be able to hunt an animal. We're not talking about fish right now, but with respect to sheep, goats, cows, birds, you can't go hunting, because if you kill the animal, then you haven't shechted it, right? You haven't slaughtered it in the proper kosher manner, which requires a very sharp knife and a slit, a very particular kind of slit across the neck where the lifeblood comes out quickly. It really minimizes the pain to the animal when it gives up its life for your dinner. So you can't go hunting, but can you trap the animal so that you can then slaughter it, butcher it, roast it, eat it on the festival? And basically now we've gone sort of one step too far. You're not going to be able to go into the woods and trap an animal and then bring it and slaughter it during the festival. You can trap it before the festival so that it's prepared for the festival, and you just go to the cage where you're storing it and then bring it out, slaughter it, etc. But so you can't trap animals on the festival. But it's not such a simple thing of what constitutes trapping, right? If you have a very large enclosure on your farm where and you have kind of a quick animal and it can get away from you even within the enclosure, so is catching the animal within that enclosure considered trapping or not? Depends. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And what I like about this discussion is we're going to do the ins and outs, trying to understand the exact specifics of what constitutes trapping, what doesn't. We're going to hear a few different points of view, but it's all very easy to imagine and very practical what they're arguing about. And so we'll do the full discussion and see the different points of view. But unlike some other discussions that are, about really nuanced points of sacrificial law, etc., this is very easy to picture. He's got the farmer, he's got the animals, he wants to rejoice on the festival, but are they considered trapped or not? Let's go. We start at the end of the B side of page 23, Mishna number 1 here in chapter 3. One may not trap fish from their ponds on a festival, even with the intention of eating them, as this falls into the category of hunting, a type of labor that is not permitted on a festival. See, fishing is okay, right? You can go fishing. It's a little bit different than hunting. Now you could go fishing with a net, you could go fishing with a line. The fish really isn't dead when you pull it out, but it might be. Fish are a little bit different. Right? They don't get slaughtered in the same way that birds and mammals do, kosher mammals. But at any rate, you can't go trapping fish on the festival either. Nor may one place food before them. Now, if you're talking about on your property, you have a pond, okay? So it may be that you often throw food into the pond, this stocked pond of fish that you eat, right? You're eating these fish from that pond, so you can't feed those fish because they have enough what to eat in their pond. You don't have to feed them on the festival. Fish in a tank that are your pet fish, that would seem to be different. They depend on you just like your dog might depend on you, but you don't eat those fish, right? And here we're talking about fish that you eat. So you can't feed the fish that are for eating that might be in your pond. You can feed them before the festival, you can feed them after the festival, but not on the festival. Nor may one place food before them, as it is not his duty to feed them. Rather, they maintain themselves by eating smaller fish or different types of algae that grow in the water. However, one may trap an animal or a bird from their enclosures, as they are viewed as already being captured, and therefore the action is not considered an act of hunting. And one may also place food before them, as one does for other household animals, right? So let's say you trapped a wild deer that is a kosher animal that you can eat on the festival. You already trapped it before the festival. Now it's in your enclosure. You did that because you're planning to eat it maybe later on in the festival, so you're going to feed it while it's there. That's okay because it's considered that it was already trapped before the festival. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says not all enclosures are the same with respect to the laws of hunting. And this is the principle. With regard to any animal inside an enclosure whose trapping is inadequate, meaning that the enclosure is large and it contains hiding places so that it is still necessary to pursue and apprehend the animal, it is prohibited for one to catch it even within that enclosure on the festival. And with regard to any animal whose trapping is not inadequate, that double negative, meaning any animal whose trapping is adequate, as it is possible to seize it immediately without having to engage in further pursuit, it is permitted for one to catch it, right? So if you've got an adequately trapped animal, you already trapped it before the festival, now it's in an enclosure where it really can't get away from you in any significant way. Okay, so you can go in. You may have to run after it a little bit, but you know you're going to catch it. It's not complicated. So that's permitted to catch it so that you could slaughter it and eat it on the festival. That's the Mishnah, Mishnah number 1. Now the Gemara. And the Gemara raises a contradiction between this Mishnah and what is stated in the Tosefta. So a Tosefta, basically contemporaneous with the Mishnah, but with a little bit of additional commentary from the rabbis of the Mishnah. And from enclosures of animals and of birds, one may not trap animals or birds on a festival, nor may one place food before them. Now, this is difficult due to a contradiction between the ruling with regard to an animal in the Mishnah and the ruling with regard to an animal in the Tosefta. And it is similarly difficult due to the contradiction between the ruling with regard to birds in the Mishnah and the ruling with regard to birds in the Tosefta. Right? In the Mishnah, it said you can't trap them if they can run away from you within the enclosure because you haven't really caught them. But if they can't really run away from you, then it is permitted to catch them. If you might have to put a little effort, but they can't really hide and get away from you. You can get them. And we're going to discuss more what that means. What is that little bit of effort? But the Tosefta seems to say that you can't trap animals within an enclosure, period. And it leaves it at that. Now, the Gemara resolves the first contradiction with respect to animals, the way it's stated, animals in an enclosure in the Mishnah versus animals in an enclosure in the Tosefta. Granted, with regard to the contradiction between the ruling concerning an animal in the Mishnah and the ruling concerning an animal in the Tosefta, la kasha, it is not difficult, because this, the Beitzah that prohibits trapping and feeding animals in the enclosures, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that an animal trapped in an enclosure whose trapping is inadequate, i.e., it is still necessary to pursue and apprehend the animal, that animal is not considered trapped, and therefore one may not trap it, even within that enclosure on a festival. Whereas the Mishnah that permits trapping and feeding the animals in the enclosures is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who maintain that an animal in an enclosure is considered trapped, and therefore removing it from the enclosure is not considered an act of hunting and trapping. As we learned in a Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says, one who drives and traps a bird into a closet or a deer into a house is liable. And the Gemara infers from this. So see what he did. He traps a bird in a closet. Say a bird flew into your house. And I'm going to tell you right now, a little foreshadowing, flash forward. A bird that flies into your house is not trapped, because that bird will not allow you to catch it. It might be inside your house, but it will fly all around the room, and you have not caught the bird just because it's inside your house. But if you somehow drive that bird into a closet, then it is considered trapped. If you drive it into a closet during a festival, you just committed the prohibited labor of trapping on a festival, right? Now you'd be liable to bring a sin offering for that. Or if you drove a deer into your house, right? A deer, somewhere on your property, like if you have a large property with a fence around it, that's not considered trapped, probably. But if you drive the deer indoors inside your house and then you close the door behind it, that deer is trapped. And if you did that on the festival, you are now liable to bring a sin offering for performing the prohibited labor of trapping on a festival. Okay? And the rabbis say one is liable for trapping a bird into a closet and for trapping a deer into a garden or into a courtyard or into an enclosure. Right, so that Rabbi Yehuda says you're not liable for trapping the deer until you drive him into your house and close the door behind him. The rabbis are more stringent, and they say you're already liable for trapping the deer if you put him into a fenced area. And this demonstrates that according to the rabbis, an animal found inside an enclosure is regarded as already captured, whereas Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says an animal like a deer is not captured until it's in a small enclosure like your house. But in a large enclosure, he's going to be really fast. He's going to be hard to catch. He might jump over the fence. You haven't caught him, right? So the rabbis say you can't drive that deer into even a large fenced area. Rabbi Yehuda says you shouldn't do that. That is a rabbinically prohibited action, but you're not liable to bring a sin offering until you actually have really trapped the deer, which would mean inside the house or some small and very firm enclosure. And so this demonstrates that according to the rabbis, an animal found inside an enclosure is regarded as already captured, whereas Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And from this it follows that Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis similarly disagree about catching an animal inside an enclosure and removing it from there on a festival. The rabbis would say, well, since you became liable for bringing a sin offering when you drove it into that fenced area, well, if it was already in that fenced area before the festival began, well, then it's already trapped as far as they're concerned. So now their stringency becomes a leniency, because during the festival, you can go and capture that deer that's already within your fenced property. Now Rabbi Yehuda's leniency, that it's not, you haven't violated the Torah prohibition if you just drove it into the fenced area. Only when you drove it into the house did you become liable for the sin offering. That leniency becomes a stringency if it's already in the fenced area during the festival. If you then went out and caught it within your large fenced-off property, according to Rabbi Yehuda, then you perform trapping during the festival. However, concerning the contradiction between the ruling with regard to birds in the Mishna and the ruling with regard to birds in the Tosefta, it is difficult, as all agree that they may not be caught even in one's house. And if you say that this contradiction is also not difficult because this, the Mishna, that permits trapping, is referring to a roofed enclosure in which a bird is considered captured and therefore there is no prohibition against apprehending it on a festival, and that the Beitzah that prohibits trapping is referring to an unroofed enclosure in which a bird is not considered trapped and apprehending it would thus be prohibited during the festival, that does not resolve our contradiction. And the Gemara explains why this proposed resolution must be rejected. As with regard to a house, which is like a roofed enclosure, there is no dispute. And according to both Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, a bird trapped into a closet, yes, it is considered trapped, while a bird into a house, no, it is not considered trapped, right? Because the bird will still fly around the house, right? So if you drove it into the house on Shabbos or a festival, then you perform trapping, you're liable to bring a sin offering. But if the bird was already in the house before the festival began, now there's a bird in your house, can you catch it and then slaughter it and roast it and eat it on the festival? No, because the fact that it's in your house doesn't mean that you've caught it. It'll take a lot of effort to catch that bird even within your house. Why? Because it's a free bird. That's why I titled today's song like from the Lynyrd Skynyrd song. And the fact that a song is also going to come up today. But a bird, even inside your house, remains a free bird. And it's not easy to catch a bird, right? So if you drove it into a closet before the festival started, okay, you could reach inside the closet and capture that bird. That's not so difficult. It was considered trapped before the festival began. From the closet, you could grab it. Now you could slaughter it properly, roast it, and eat it. Rabba bar Rav Huna said, here in the Mishnah, according to which a bird in a house is not considered trapped, we are dealing with a free bird. A sparrow, for example, which does not accept authority. The bird is not intimidated, and it evades capture even inside a house. As the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, why is it called a free bird? Because it dwells, a bird is a dror, and dwells, dara. So these words are that share the same letters, and so they're related, right? So a bird Why is it called a free bird? Dro, because it dwells, dara, in a house as it does in the field. Even when you put it in the house, its nature is that it's a free bird. It's just like the song. I must be traveling on now. I wish I could sing. And this bird you cannot tame. Right? Because it dwells in a house in the same way that it does in the field, flittering from place to place. And for this reason, it is not considered captured even when it is inside a house. Therefore, the distinction between a roofed and an unroofed enclosure resolves the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah and the Tosefta. And the Gemara comments, now that you have arrived at this understanding, that the difference between the rulings in the two sources is predicated on different circumstances and not on a dispute between the rabbis of the Mishnah, the apparent contradiction between the ruling with regard to an animal in the Mishnah and the ruling with regard to an animal in the Tosefta is also not difficult. This, the ruling in the Mishnah, that permits apprehending the animal is referring to a small enclosure in which the animal cannot evade its pursuers and requires no further trapping. And that, the ruling in the Tosefta that prohibits apprehending the animal is referring to a large enclosure from which the animal cannot escape, but it can still avoid being caught. Running around, big space, nooks and crannies. It's difficult to catch it even within the enclosure. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of a small enclosure and what are the circumstances of a large enclosure? Which is which? How do we know if we're talking about a small enclosure or a large enclosure? At the extremes, it's obvious, but that gray zone in between, how are we going to define whether it's permitted to, apprehend rather than capture or trap? Is it permitted to apprehend that animal within the enclosure? How small does the enclosure have to be so that it's considered trapped when the festival already began and we can go out and grab it, slaughter it, roast it, and eat it? Rav Ashi said, any enclosure where one can run after an animal and reach it in one stoop. A stoop? What do you mean reach it in one stoop? This will be explained. Is a small enclosure, and any other is a large enclosure. What is one stoop? The Rashba reads this word shihiyah, meaning in one pause, i.e. that the relevant issue is not whether he can catch the animal by stooping once, by bending over once, but whether he is able to do so in one attempt without having to rest in between. Right? If the effort required to apprehend the animal within the enclosure is such that you could just kind of go after it in one, continuous effort, then you can apprehend it. But if you're going to have to lunge this way and lunge that way, get yourself a little bit out of breath, take a rest, try again, then the enclosure's too big. Catching that animal is considered trapping. And if you didn't do that before the festival, you can't do it on the festival. Or perhaps any enclosure that has a series of corners in which the animal could hide and evade capture is a large enclosure, and any other is a small enclosure. Or perhaps any enclosure where the shadows from the different walls fall upon each other because the walls are close together is a small enclosure, and any other, a larger area where the walls are further apart, is a large enclosure, right? So as the sun passes overhead over the course of the day, if the shadow that this wall casts in the morning doesn't meet the shadow that wall casts in the afternoon, then it's a large enclosure. So there's three different definitions. Can you catch the animal in one effort? Does it have many corners? Does the animal have many corners which it can hide in? Or are the walls close enough together that their shadows would touch? So what is it? What is an enclosure? Here's the law. Any enclosure whose walls are so close together that their shadows overlap in the middle, or where one can catch the animal in a single stoop, is considered a small enclosure. If one drove an animal into such an enclosure, he is liable. Right? If the animal needed to be in that enclosure before the festival began for you to be able to go into that enclosure and pick up the animal and then slaughter it, roast it, eat it during the festival. Driving an animal into such a small enclosure during the festival, prohibited because that enclosure, it's considered trapped once it's in there. So if you drove it in there, then you trapped it, and you can't do that on the festival. It was taught in the Mishna. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, not all enclosures are identical. If the animal is inadequately trapped in the enclosure, it is prohibited for one to catch it, whereas if it is adequately trapped, he is permitted to do so. Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said. The law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, if one rules that the law is in accordance with his opinion, does that mean by inference that the rabbis disagree? Or perhaps there is no dispute and everyone accepts the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rav Yosef said to him, and what difference is there to you whether or not the rabbis disagree? Right? So we've established that the law is according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Does that mean that his ruling outweighed the majority and they disagreed with him, but we follow the ruling of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? Or did he just state the law and everyone agrees with it? So that was the question that Abaye asked his teacher, Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, what do you care? The law is that if the enclosure has places to hide, then an animal within it is not considered trapped. It doesn't matter whether the rabbis agree or disagree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, because that is the law. Now, Abaye's answer to Rav Yosef is spectacular. In either case, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban ben Shimon ben Gamliel. Why then does it matter whether or not the issue was in dispute? Abaye said to Rav Yosef, invoking a folk expression with regard to one who learns without reaching understanding. Is it simply learn the lesson, let it be like a song? In other words, is it sufficient to simply parrot the halachic ruling? Rather, it is necessary to examine the issue to understand it, even if it does not yield a practical legal difference. Abaye answered his teacher, well, it may not make a difference in terms of rulings that we issue so people know what to do, whether they can trap an animal or not, but I would like to know how the law came to be what it is today. Who knows, in the future might really make a difference, whether that's a unanimous opinion or just a minority that in this case came to be the ruling over the majority, because maybe it'll be reversed later for some new circumstance. So it's a good one for us to remember. Are we going to allow the law to be like a song? In this case, song is being used as a negative description, meaning you're just chanting the law the way you learned it, but you don't understand why the law is the way that it is. That's bad. You should have a deeper understanding, right? Don't just be able to sing the lyrics. Understand what you're singing when you sing those lyrics. It was further taught in the Mishna, this is the principle: any animal inside such an enclosure whose trapping is inadequate may not be caught and removed from there on a festival, whereas any animal whose trapping is not inadequate, meaning its trapping is adequate, may be apprehended and removed from there. Now the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of an animal whose trapping is inadequate? And Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, any animal with regard to which one would say, bring a trap so that we may catch it, as the animal cannot be apprehended without the aid of a trap. So that's a little bit different definition. It's not that the enclosure is so large or that the animal has corners to run into or that the walls are close enough that the shadows overlap. Now it's you can't catch the animal unless you bring some kind of a device to help you catch it. If you need such a device, right, bring a trap, some kind of a trap, then you can't do it on the festival, according to this view. Abaye said to him, but aren't geese and chickens that are loose in a courtyard creatures with regard to which one would say, bring a trap so that we may catch it, as they freely roam about and evade capture? Wasn't Rocky, right? Wasn't one of the exercises that Rocky had to do, and I think in the first movie, right, that his trainer said to him, go catch the chicken, right? And if that's going to increase your footwork and make you quicker. It's not so easy. Like, okay, he has to be like a world champion boxer to catch a chicken. It's not easy to catch a chicken. I'm sure people here who have farm experience can testify that it's not so easy to catch a chicken. So you might use a device to trap the chicken. And nevertheless, it is taught in a Beitzah, one who traps geese, chickens, or domestic doves, like in his courtyard, is exempt, as they are considered already trapped. So you might need a device to help you trap your chickens or your geese or your doves that are already on your property. You own them, you've been feeding them. That you definitely think of your chickens and geese as, trapped from the onset of the festival. They don't need to be, and capturing them on the festival so that you can slaughter and roast and eat them. That can't be a prohibited labor for sure. If you need to catch your chicken, and the only way to catch your chickens is with some kind of a trap, that's not going to violate this prohibition. So this definition of using a trap can't be the definition which renders capturing that animal prohibited. Abaye said he brought up the geese and chickens. So Rabba bar Rav Huna said that Shmuel said, addressing this issue, there's a difference between the two cases. These, the geese and chickens, enter their coop in the evening and use it as their fixed dwelling place and are therefore considered trapped. From before the festival, and capturing them in your courtyard is permitted. While these animals in the enclosure, right, that were trapped before the festival so that they wouldn't roam in the wild, right? But they still have a different nature, even in their enclosure, than the chicken and geese do. Because in their enclosure, they do not enter their coop in the evening, and therefore they flee from those who are trying to seize them. The chickens and geese might flee too, but it's a different kind of flight. And the Gemara challenges this argument. Well, wait a minute. What about doves? Don't doves of a dovecote and doves of a loft enter their coop in the evening? And yet it is taught in a Beitzah, one who traps doves of a dovecote or doves of a loft or birds that are nesting in their pitchers in buildings is liable for their capture, even though they enter their coop in the evening. What's the difference between geese and chickens on the one hand and doves on the other? So rather, Rabba bar Rav Huna said that Shmuel said, a distinction can be made as follows. These, the geese and chickens, enter their coop in the evening, and providing them with their feed is your responsibility. They are therefore accustomed to their owners, and they are considered as if trapped. Whereas these, the doves of a dovecote, and the other birds mentioned in the Beitzah, admittedly they enter their coop in the evening, but feeding them is not your responsibility. Now, I've never kept doves in a dovecote, so I'm not sure exactly what this means. But if we're talking about doves that are free to fly and it's their nature to come back to the dovecote, well, you might give them some food while they're in the dovecote, but they can also go out and eat on their own. So they're not dependent on you for their feed the same way that the chickens and geese roaming around your farmyard are. And Rav Mari said an alternative distinction. He said, these, the doves of a dovecote, are likely to flee from people and therefore require trapping, while these, the geese, chickens, and domestic doves, are not likely to flee from them. And the Gemara asks, well, all of them are also likely to flee when they are being pursued, even chickens. And the Gemara answers, we meant to say that they are likely to flee to their coop. In other words, even when they reach their coop, they do not remain still, but continue in their attempts to escape, and are therefore not considered trapped. Like those other ones that don't, that remain free birds, essentially. Whereas the geese and chickens, they might run away from you in the yard, but they're not going to flee from the yard, right? They're going to go back to their coop. Eventually, you're going to catch them, and they're just considered domesticated and trapped in your yard, and you can grab them on the festival. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1. Here in chapter 3, we're just going to read Mishnah number 2 and a couple of paragraphs of Gemara, and then I'm going to questions and comments. Mishnah number 2. If traps for animals, birds, and fish were set on the eve of a festival, meaning before the festival, the afternoon before the festival began that night, one may not take anything from them on the festival unless he knows for certain that the animals found in the traps had already been caught on the eve of the festival, before the festival began. And an incident is related where a certain Gentile, a non-Jew, brought fish to Rabban Gamliel, and Rabban Gamliel said, the fish are permitted, but I do not wish to accept them from him. This turns out to be just this particular person and Rabban Gamliel didn't get along. That person brought Rabban Gamliel some kind of a gift, maybe, I don't know why. But Rabban Gamliel, maybe he was offended on some earlier occasion or something went wrong between these two people. I don't think it's that relevant that it's a non-Jew. He just doesn't want to accept from this person. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. The Gemara raises a question about the story involving Rabban Gamliel. Was an incident cited above to contradict a previously stated law? The Mishnah first teaches that one may not eat an animal caught on a festival, right? If it's trapped on the festival, then it wasn't prepared for use on the, before the festival. So it's just like the egg that we started this tractate with. If an egg is laid on the festival, so you can't eat that egg, right? Right. Beis Hillel prohibits, Shammai permits, and we follow Beis Hillel on that. So a newly laid egg on the festival, you can't use it because it wasn't prepared for use from before the festival. Likewise, an animal that gets trapped during the festival, you're not allowed to go trap the animal. That's what we were just discussing in the first mission of chapter 3. What if it was passively caught? Like you set the trap before the festival, so you didn't do anything during the festival, and then you go out in the morning of the festival and there's an animal in the trap. Can you now take that animal out of the trap, slaughter it properly, roast it, and eat it? The issue is, was it caught in that trap before the festival began, like yesterday afternoon, or was it caught in that trap overnight or this morning? If you don't know for sure, because of uncertainty, they're going to prohibit it. If you know for sure that it was trapped before the festival began, then it's going to be permitted to eat it. And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah is incomplete. It is missing an important element, and it teaches the following. Even in a case where it is uncertain whether or not the animal was prepared before the festival, as it is unclear whether it was caught today or on a previous day, it is prohibited. Right? In the case of uncertainty, because it might have been trapped during the festival, the rabbis prohibited you to eat that animal on the festival. Rabban Gamliel rules more leniently and he permits it. And an incident is also related where a certain Gentile brought fish to Rabban Gamliel during the festival. And Rabban Gamliel said, well, the fish are permitted, right? He's not sure whether they were caught before the festival or during the festival. So in cases of uncertainty, Rabban Gamliel permits. But he still didn't eat it because he didn't want to wish to accept them from him. The reason he made that clear to the people around him is he's saying, my legal ruling is in cases of uncertainty, you can eat the fish. I'm not going to eat it, but don't read from that my ruling is you can't eat fish that might have been caught during the festival. I would eat them. I just don't want to take a gift from this individual. But Rabban Gamliel is in the minority, and the law follows the majority on this issue. And if in cases of uncertainty, you may not eat something that may have been trapped or caught on the festival. And Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said the law is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, and some teach this legal ruling with regard to this Beitzah as it is taught, with regard to something about which uncertainty exists, whether or not it was prepared before the festival. Rabban Gamliel permits it, and Rabbi Yehoshua prohibits it. And Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, and others teach it in a different way. But in cases of uncertainty, whether it was caught, trapped on the festival or not, we are not permitted to eat it. Oh my gosh, stop. Okay, let's see if there are questions or comments. Okay. Bill Eldridge says, I'm with Rabbi Yehuda. Before we sold it, the old farmstead was 60 fenced acres. And the deer regarded us as, at most, annoying neighbors, certainly not captors. Notable also that the barbed wire fencing, more than enough to hold out the neighbor's cattle, was scoffed at by the spry deer. Scoffed, I say. Bill, I look forward to having a beer with you someday. I think we get along great in person. I love your language. But exactly, right? The fact that a deer might be within that enclosure is far from, meaning that that deer is trapped. On the other hand, the cattle, they're not leaving that enclosure. They're not moving so fast. So, going out and catching one of those cows and bringing it, out to the barn where it's going to get slaughtered, butchered, roasted and eaten, that is not a prohibited act of trapping on the festival. So it's very different. The same enclosure. Are we talking about a cow? Are we talking about a deer? It's going to produce a very different result because one is considered trapped within such an enclosure and the other is not. And it makes sense according to all that we've seen today. Sharon, what if the reason you can't trap the animal is not because of the animal's conditions, but because the owner has physical limitations? They may need a trap for their ease, while others might have no difficulty in doing this. That's a great question. I think we've seen a bunch of cases where they're going to make a ruling according to the typical individual. So I'm not sure. I think in such a case, like the person should consult the rabbi. And I'm not a rabbi. But it would seem to me, right, that if the average person, wouldn't need a trap to capture the cow within a fenced acre, you could just walk up to him and walk him back, right? But, somebody who, let's say, was wheelchair bound or something and had to entice the cow to walk over, and once he walked over, he was kind of trapped, and all the more with a chicken, right? All the more, right? Like, it's not easy to capture a chicken. So maybe most people could capture a chicken like in a fenced in backyard, that's like 20 by 30 feet. But, somebody who's a little older, who has a broken leg, who walks with a cane, much more difficult for him to capture that chicken. And I think that's the case they're talking about here. You can, so that person would absolutely use a trap to capture that chicken. Nevertheless, the chicken is already considered trapped before the festival began because it's a domesticated bird that you feed, that sleeps in its coop at night. And the fact that you need this so-called trap to catch it, I think there it's almost like a term of art. It's not really a trap. It's just an aid to help you apprehend an animal that is already considered trapped. Sharon, if you cannot use the animal in the trap, do you release it? Surely you don't leave it in the trap. That would be inhumane. Right, so if you set a trap before the festival started, and now you come along, you find an animal in the trap. Now, due to uncertainty, was it caught there before the festival began or after the festival began? So it's not permitted for you to take it out, slaughter it, and eat it. But it's cruel to the animal to leave it in this little cage till the end of the festival. Can you release it? I'm having trouble imagining what the prohibition on releasing the animal would be. I don't think there's any prohibited labor in that. So probably you can release it, but we'd have to think it through a little more carefully. I just don't think that there would be a prohibited labor in just releasing the animal. You're not preparing it for use after the festival. You're just releasing it back out into the wild for the sake of the animal. Seems to me like it's okay, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night when Shabbos ends. Now we're in that, that steeply, the times are changing quicker and quicker. So we should be able to get the show on after Shabbos ends, by about 8:30, 8:15 p.m. LA time. And, as it gets darker earlier and earlier, it'll get more and more reasonable for the Saturday night show. Have a beautiful Shabbos and a good Moed, Moedim L'Simcha. All the best.